Have you ever stopped to consider that your core identity, the you that you recognize in the mirror every morning, isn't actually a reflection of who you are right now,
Hmm.
but maybe more of a historical construct? That your sense of self is defined less by what you do in the present moment and more by how you felt during, I guess, significant, intense moments in your past.
Well, that's really the pivotal question, isn't it? It anchors our whole discussion today. We're undertaking a pretty essential deep dive into the architecture of the self,
Right.
and we're specifically focusing on the ideas laid out in the Foundations of Angel Wing, Volume 1. It's this foundational technical research. It explores the rigorous and often, frankly, surprising connection between raw emotional intensity and the way our continuous self-narrative gets built, like brick by emotional brick.
Yeah, that image really lands. And before we, start unpacking this complex framework, we absolutely want to acknowledge the dedicated effort and deep analysis that went
Uh-huh.
into creating this material.
Absolutely.
We owe immense thanks to Dr. Chaitanya Kripalu, the founder and CEO of the Angel Wing, LLC,
Hmm.
Dr. Elizabeth Berman, who's a valued member of Angel Wing's mastermind group and a dedicated presenter,
Yes.
and especially Sachin J. Karnik. He's the researcher who performed all the background research for the Foundations of Angel Wing Volume 1 technical book, their work.
Yeah.
It really provides a stunning insight into the mechanics of human identity.
It truly does. So our mission today really is to take these technical mechanisms, things like memory selectivity, emotional imprinting, and the psychological distortions that result from them, and kind of translate them into actionable knowledge for you, the listener.
Okay.
We're going to define the core terms, analyze the neurological mechanics that can bind us to the past, and ultimately explore what this all means for achieving, true personal freedom right here in the present.
Okay, let's unpack this fundamental idea first.
Yeah.
The self-narrative as an architectural illusion.
Yeah.
I mean, when we talk about me, we just assume there's this consistent, stable person that exists across time, right?
Right.
The you from high school, the you listening right now, the you planning retirement, it feels like they're all linked by this, like, unbreakable thread. So why does the research call that thread an illusion?
Well, because stability, when you look at biological and psychological reality, it's kind of a fiction. You are literally a different person today than you were even a year ago.
Hmm.
Your cells have regenerated, your experiences have actually altered your brain chemistry, your beliefs might have shifted.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the memory system works relentlessly, almost automatically, to maintain the illusion of a stable self persisting through all this constant change. So the core concept here is that memory doesn't just store things passively.
Right.
It functions as the architect of identity. It actively builds that sense of me.
Okay, so memory constructs this continuous, stable story by linking the past, present, and future. It uses those linguistic markers we all use. I was, I am, and I will be.
Yeah.
Why is that so crucial? Is it just for feeling stable, or is there more to it?
Oh, it's crucial for survival, really.
Mhm.
Without that feeling of continuity, we couldn't function socially, we couldn't plan effectively. I mean, imagine if you didn't remember your skills or your obligations from one day to the next.
Okay.
Total chaos. So the continuity is necessary, absolutely, but it's the method of construction where the bias creeps in. And this is where we need to define the self-narrative. It's that internal, coherent, and continuous story we tell ourselves about who we are.
All right.
It links selected past events, our present identity, and our future potential. But the problem, as this research details so well, is that this narrative is constructed entirely through, well, selectivity.
Right, which brings us to that crucial point. Memory isn't like a perfect video recording. It's not capturing everything.
Not at all.
If it were, we'd just be overwhelmed, right?
Right.
Drowning in data. The research really emphasizes that memory is inherently selective. It's an active kind of editorial process, not just a passive storage dump.
Absolutely. And it's not just selective, it's aggressively filtered. This selectivity determines what we actually retain and what gets discarded. It filters our experience of reality based on specific criteria. The researchers highlight two main filtering mechanisms. First one, emotional significance.
Okay, emotional significance, meaning if an event didn't register a strong emotional spike, like a real high of joy or a deep low of despair or fear, it generally doesn't make it into the long-term narrative file. It's just background noise.
That's pretty much it. The sheer volume of neutral or maybe mildly pleasant daily life, the routine commute, the average conversation, those quiet hours of work, most of it just gets jettisoned because the brain basically deems it low priority data. It wasn't important enough emotionally.
Huh.
And the second filtering mechanism is psychological relevance. Basically, does this memory support the current identity structure we're trying to maintain?
Ah, okay. That still sounds like a self-fulfilling prophecy then.
It kind of is.
If I believe I'm generally, say, a cautious person, maybe a bit socially awkward, my brain will unconsciously hold on to memories that affirm that belief.
Exactly.
And maybe downplay or even forget experiences where I was actually quite bold or outgoing.
That is the inherent flaw, or maybe feature, depending on how you look at it, in this architectural illusion. If the self-narrative is built only from these filtered memories, the result is that the narrative is profoundly inherently biased.
Right.
We're not operating on an objective account of our lives. We're living inside a highly curated highlight reel. And crucially, this highlight reel isn't edited for objective truth.
No.
It's edited for subjective importance based purely on those emotional spikes and what affirms our existing self-concept. The research suggests this process actively discards something like 90% of our lived reality.
Wow. 90%.
Just to confirm the 10% we currently believe is important about ourselves.
So if we look at someone, maybe someone struggling with persistent low self-worth, the narrative they tell themselves, the story of me in their head, will inevitably feature a collection of the most painful, maybe shameful or fearful memories, because those are the most emotionally significant ones. Their brain has essentially handed them this, like, flawed document and declared, this is your history, this is who you are.
Precisely. The research demonstrates that the selectivity of memory is really the root cause of this identity bias. The filter works so effectively that we often find it almost impossible to recall countless neutral moments, maybe moments of quiet competency, that might directly contradict the highly emotional yet factually isolated moment of shame that we cling to so tightly.
Yeah.
The self-narrative is, by its very architecture, a biased construct. It's designed to affirm its own continuity, even if that continuity is actually rooted in suffering.
Okay, so if selectivity is the primary editor, the research makes it really clear that emotional intensity is the primary director, or maybe, like you said, the dictator of retention.
Dictator is a strong word, but maybe accurate in its impact.
Yeah. This is where we move from the abstract structure to the, well, the physical mechanism inside us. Why is emotion the instruction manual for memory storage? What's happening biologically?
Well, fundamentally, emotion is the brain's evolutionary alarm system. It signals importance, often related directly to survival.
Okay.
So if an event is emotionally charged, think of a near-miss accident, or the ecstasy of a first love, or maybe a profound public humiliation, the brain interprets this as critical data. Absolutely critical. Data that must be stored immediately and robustly.
Right. Don't forget this.
Exactly. The research shows that emotional intensity directly dictates the strength and the persistence of memory encoding. The stronger the emotion, the more vividly the experience is encoded, and crucially, the longer it endures in memory.
Okay, so we need to dive into the technical core here.
Right.
Because this isn't just a vague feeling. It's a process involving intense cooperation between two critical parts of the brain, which the material details: the amygdala and the hippocampus.
That's right. These two are key players. So, the amygdala. Think of it as an almond-shaped cluster of nuclei located deep within the temporal lobe. Its primary job is processing emotion, especially things like fear, threat assessment, but also pleasure. It's like the brain's emotional rapid response unit.
Okay, the emotional hotspot.
You could say that. And then the hippocampus, which is right next door, structurally, is vital for forming new memories. It's responsible for converting immediate short-term data into long-term accessible memories.
So the emotion center and the memory-making center are neighbors.
Yeah.
How does their physical interaction actually dictate this process of emotional imprinting?
It's about communication and chemistry. When an intense emotional event occurs, the amygdala activates almost instantly. This activation doesn't just register the emotion like, oh, I feel scared. It triggers the rapid release of stress hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol, into the system.
Oh, the stress hormones.
Yes. And these hormones circulating through the brain act like a massive, let's say, a priority stamp on the encoding process that's happening in the nearby hippocampus.
I like that, a priority stamp. So the amygdala is basically shouting at the hippocampus, drop everything. This data set is essential. Engrave it.
That's a great analogy,
Yeah.
exactly. The physiological presence of those stress hormones chemically enhances the process called long-term potentiation.
Okay, what's that?
That's the underlying mechanism by which neural connections are strengthened for memory storage.
Oh.
So the stronger the emotional signal coming from the amygdala,
Uh-huh.
the better, the stronger, the more robust the encoding by the hippocampus. This is the physical mechanism behind why highly charged or traumatic experiences get stored with what the research terms disproportionate weight.
Let's pause on that phrase. Disproportionate weight. That sounds critical. If we're weighing our memories, the research is suggesting that a single intensely traumatic event, say 1 hour of severe public humiliation, can actually outweigh psychologically and define the cumulative mass of years, maybe even a decade, of quiet, stable, positive moments.
It's the profound tragedy of the system in a way. The sheer density of the emotional encoding for that 1 hour means it takes up far more psychological space, far more weight than the thousands of hours of ordinary happiness or competence.
Wow.
So the self-concept, therefore, becomes defined, or at least very heavily anchored, not by the totality of our experience, but by the residues of unprocessed emotion left over from those few incredibly intense events.
So it's not even the memory of the event, but the feeling left over.
Precisely. It's the residual feeling of shame, let's say, not the factual event of the humiliation itself that continues to shape identity years, even decades later.
Okay, that means the intense memory isn't just a record of the past. It's like an active emotional engine running right now in the present.
Absolutely.
So if I experienced, I don't know, a moment of crippling abandonment when I was 10,
Yeah.
the emotional residue, that fear of being alone, maybe that sense of unworthiness, remains chemically and neurologically accessible, ready to be reactivated long after the original incident is objectively gone.
That is the predictive power of this architectural analysis. The intensity of the past dictates the emotional baseline of the present. The brain, always seeking to affirm the continuity of the self-narrative.
Right, that illusion of stability.
It keeps these intense emotional files, front-loaded, easily accessible. It ensures the feeling persists, even when the original context has completely vanished. And this is where distortion becomes basically inevitable.
Right, so if the brain is aggressively prioritizing and disproportionately weighting these painful emotional memories, distortion isn't just a risk.
No.
It's pretty much a guarantee.
It seems to be, yes.
The narrative stops being a functional guide and starts becoming, like you said earlier, maybe a weapon aimed at the self.
It absolutely can create a powerful, persistent memory-based bias towards suffering and inadequacy. I mean, think of it this way. A single emotionally painful event can just overshadow countless neutral or even positive ones.
Yeah.
We hold on to the single failure with the intensity of a survival alert, like danger, remember this, while hundreds of small successes or neutral moments are simply logged as, expected behavior and they just fade into obscurity.
Okay.
This establishes a kind of baseline of perception where we start to believe our flaws are somehow more real, more defining than our strengths or our moments of resilience.
There's an illustrative example from the Foundations of Angel Wing, Volume 1, that's just so startling here.
Mm-hmm.
The material notes that a single instance of, say, professional failure experienced with intense shame might define decades of self-doubt and career hesitation.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the countless moments of competence, the skills learned, the successes achieved that led to that professional position in the first place, they become psychologically irrelevant, forgotten.
Exactly. And this leads directly to a really critical psychological concept that the research unpacks: the hardening of transient states.
Okay. The hardening of transient states. What does that mean?
It means as these intense, often negative emotional memories keep recurring, and it's crucial, it's not the events themselves recurring, but the feelings associated with them.
Right, the residue.
The residue, yes. As that feeling recurs, it stops being viewed as a temporary occurrence, a transient state, and it begins to coalesce, to harden into a sense of identity. This is what the research defines as emotional identification.
Okay, how does emotional identification differ from just, experiencing and processing strong emotions? We all feel strong things.
The difference is profound, and it's really the key cognitive trap we fall into. Emotional identification is the phenomenon where these recurring emotional memories are mistakenly viewed as intrinsic, fixed qualities of the self.
So it's a misinterpretation.
A deep misinterpretation. The mind makes a logical leap, but it's a deeply erroneous one. Instead of observing, perhaps, I am experiencing profound anxiety due to this stressful situation right now,
Uh-huh.
the mind completes this kind of linguistic fusion and declares, I am anxious. Full stop. It mistakes the transient temporary state for a permanent defining quality of being.
That linguistic fusion. Wow, the transformation of an experience into an identity label. That happens constantly, doesn't it?
All the time.
We see it everywhere, like the transformation of, I am experiencing grief after this loss into the fixed label, I am broken.
Precisely. Or, I committed a mistake, which is a behavior, becomes I am a failure, which is an identity.
Right. Why does the mind do that? Why cling to the negative label?
Because, going back to the first point, the mind desperately seeks continuity. It needs that thread. And if it can't find stable continuity in factual external events, because reality is constantly changing, fluxing, it finds it in the persistent emotional residue. It clings to the feeling of brokenness or anger or anxiety as evidence of its own continuity. The mind essentially argues, since I still feel the shame from that thing a decade ago, that must mean I am still, fundamentally, a shameful person.
That's the moment, isn't it? The moment we surrender our present reality to a past feeling. We basically give the emotional memory permission to dictate our self-perception right now.
That's it, exactly. And the consequences of this distortion, they're devastating for personal growth and well-being.
I can see that.
They are. The end result of this entire process, the selective memory, the disproportionate weighting of negative events, and then this emotional identification, is that the self becomes essentially just a repository of emotional residues. You're no longer truly living in the freshness of presence, responding authentically to the facts of today. Instead, you're living from the inertia of memory. The material captures this so perfectly by stating that the individual becomes a historical echo.
A historical echo. I really like that phrase. It's evocative. It implies that we're constantly vibrating, subtly or not so subtly, with the sound waves of yesterday's unresolved emotional struggles.
Precisely.
We end up being defined not by today's competence or joy or awareness, but by yesterday's anxiety or anger or that lingering feeling of unworthiness.
And because that historical echo is sustained by such intense emotional encoding, remember the amygdala and hippocampus connection?
Right, the priority stamp.
It requires minimal activation energy to resurface. The memory architecture ensures that these specific, often painful imprints are highly accessible. They're ready and waiting to dictate your reaction in any situation that even vaguely resembles the original trigger. This isn't just a psychological tendency. It's the efficient but ultimately flawed design of our memory system trying to keep us safe based on past data.
Okay, so if we are these historical echoes, what mechanism keeps the echo reverberating? It can't just be a static state, right? It feels like a perpetual motion machine that locks the individual into this historical narrative.
That's a good way to put it. It is like a machine. And that mechanism is the mutually reinforcing cycle, or what the research calls the feedback loop, between memory and emotion.
Okay, the feedback loop.
Yeah. We discussed the first part of this loop already. Emotion gives memory meaning or significance. It dictates the encoding strength, right? That was section 2.
Right, the intensity makes it stick.
Exactly. But the second function of this loop is the mechanism that actively sustains our misidentification and our reactivity. And that is, memory gives emotion continuity.
Okay, let's delve deep into that continuity aspect.
Yeah.
How does memory give emotion continuity? That sounds a bit backward initially.
It does, but think about it like this. Remembering past feelings literally recreates the physical and neurological state associated with them right here in the present.
Really?
Physically, to a degree, yes. When you actively recall a moment of profound resentment or anger from, say, 5 years ago, you don't just pull up the factual details, the what happened. You actually fire up many of the same neural pathways.
Wow.
And the brain releases similar neurochemicals associated with that original emotional state. Maybe at a lower intensity, maybe not, but the signature is there.
Okay, so that means every time we indulge in a negative memory, replaying the argument in our head, rehashing the insult, brooding over the failure, we're essentially injecting a dose of the past emotional residue back into our current system. We're literally self-triggering.
Precisely. You are self-triggering. The recollection acts as a powerful physical and psychological trigger. It revives the associated feeling, the anger, the shame, the fear, and that revived feeling then confirms the illusion of a consistent emotional self.
Ah, so the feeling proves the identity.
Yes. The mind looks at the renewed feeling and says, see, I'm still angry about that person or situation. That proves I'm fundamentally a resentful person, or I still feel inadequate, therefore I am inadequate. The past feeling becomes current evidence for the present identity, sustaining the entire illusionary structure.
And the duration aspect here is crucial, isn't it? The original activating experience might have lasted, I don't know, 30 minutes.
Yeah, right. Maybe even less.
But the emotional residue, the echo, is kept active and psychologically viable for potentially decades by this constant recollection loop. We are, in a sense, choosing to re-experience trauma or inadequacy through active, often unconscious, recall.
That choice, whether conscious or unconscious, sustains the misidentification and the emotional reactivity. The research highlights that this loop ensures the individual remains bound to an internal narrative dictated entirely by past reactions, those intense, often survival-based responses, rather than being guided by conscious choice in the present moment. This is the very definition of living out a dictated narrative.
Okay.
We think we're making conscious decisions in the now, but very often we're simply executing the programmed responses written by our past emotional spikes.
That's a staggering implication for personal freedom. It really reframes it. It means that freedom isn't just about, external circumstances or choices. It's fundamentally about breaking free from internal slavery to historical emotional data. If my response to my boss today is actually being dictated by the chemical signature left over from my interactions with my father 30 years ago, I'm not free. Not really.
Absolutely not. The inertia of memory dictates the present. When an individual is operating primarily within this feedback loop, they're inherently incapable of genuine self-mastery because their default response is always going to be a reflexive response tied inextricably to the past.
Yeah.
The self-narrative, built on these intense, selective emotional imprints, effectively ensures that yesterday's anxiety will generate tomorrow's fear, or yesterday's anger will fuel today's resentment, unless that loop is consciously interrupted and eventually broken. Understanding this architecture, that's the absolute prerequisite for dismantling it.
Okay, so the crucial question then becomes, how do we break free? If the very architecture of our identity is potentially flawed, biased, and dictated by these past emotional residues, what's the pathway towards something like self-mastery? And this is where we can bring in some context from the related materials on transformation, right? Addressing the so what of this whole deep dive.
Exactly. The initial analysis of the self-narrative architecture as laid out in Foundations reveals that what we often mistake for our core self is actually just a collection of, well, erroneous identifications. They're based on past circumstances, past emotional experiences, past conditioning.
Okay.
So if the emotional mind, with its selective memories and its tendency to create these fixed labels, is not the true fundamental self, then the goal of self-mastery, as hinted at in the broader context, is to transcend this emotionally dictated narrative, to move beyond identifying solely with the mind-body complex.
Right. The ultimate purpose, then, seems to be awareness. We need to somehow catch this reflexive response in the act before the past completely takes over the present moment. But why is catching it so incredibly difficult? Why do we keep reacting in exactly the ways we swore we wouldn't?
It comes down to speed and wiring. The emotional architecture prioritizes speed over sophistication, especially when threat is perceived, even if it's just psychological threat.
Okay.
When we get triggered by that deep emotional programming, that historical echo we talked about, our response feels instantaneous because it leverages the fast, evolutionarily older, hardwired limbic system.
Right, the survival brain.
Exactly. And this speed allows the emotional reaction to effectively bypass the part of the brain responsible for thoughtful, conscious, rational decision-making.
And that part, we need to define it clearly, is the prefrontal cortex.
Yes, the prefrontal cortex. It's the anterior part of the frontal lobes, right behind the forehead. It's associated with all our complex cognitive functions: executive control, planning, integrating knowledge, making conscious, reasoned decisions. It's the rational thinking part of the brain, you could say.
Cognitive.
But when stress or intense emotion arises, the amygdala triggers a response so rapidly that the prefrontal cortex, which processes information much more slowly, it requires more energy, more time for deliberation, is literally bypassed in that initial moment.
That completely explains the impulsive reaction, the thing you regret saying 2 seconds later.
It does.
If you get a harsh email, the historical echo takes over. Your amygdala screams, threat, attack, and you fire back an angry reply before your cortex even has time to, read the second paragraph, analyze the sender's likely intent, consider the consequences, and formulate a calm, strategic response.
Precisely. That reflexive response, dictated entirely by the past programming, prevents us from engaging the higher-level functions needed for true conscious choice in the moment. Therefore, reclaiming control over our reactions is achieved by intentionally, consciously introducing a pause into this automatic bypass mechanism.
A pause.
Yes, a moment of space. The goal is to shift from an unconscious state of just reflexive responses, driven by the loop, to a conscious state of observation and choice.
Okay, so how does the individual, who might be operating primarily as a historical echo, actually learn to do that?
Yeah.
How do they engage the prefrontal cortex when the amygdala is screaming?
This is where the practice of awareness and observation, often termed mindfulness, becomes absolutely essential. The foundational ideas here emphasize that you must begin by objectively observing your mental journeys, your thoughts, your emotional spikes as they arise, the cascades of feeling, but critically observing them without becoming entangled in them.
Without identifying.
Without identifying with every thought or feeling that floats by. So if you observe the thought, "I am a failure," pop up, you simply note it. There is the failure thought, recognizing it as a mental event, likely stemming from an old emotional identification, rather than immediately accepting it as an intrinsic capital T truth about yourself.
It's like shifting perspective from being identified with the feeling, being in the fire, consumed by it, to simply observing the architecture of the fire, the pattern of it, maybe from a safer distance. The awareness itself isolates the memory structure.
Beautifully put, yes. By observing the emotional imprint, for instance, noticing the physical rush of anxiety that accompanies a certain memory or situation, you begin to recognize that the feeling is a historical residue. It's an echo. It's not a mandatory present reality that has to dictate your actions.
Okay.
This objective observation creates that critical space, that pause needed for the prefrontal cortex to come online and engage. That moment of non-identification allows the conscious, rational self to potentially intercept the reflexive reaction before the emotional energy can fully dictate behavior.
And this process, presumably, needs to be repeated, strengthened like a muscle.
Absolutely, it's a practice. But as it's repeated and strengthened, it moves the individual toward the ultimate goal of transformation, which is often described as achieving a state of tranquility and stability.
And what does that state feel like based on this framework?
That stable state is defined by being increasingly unencumbered by past thoughts, past desires, and those clinging emotional memories. By understanding how the architecture of emotion and memory works, by seeing the selectivity, the disproportionate weight, the feedback loop in action, you start to realize that these psychological burdens are largely manufactured limitations. They're not inherent truths about who you are.
Right.
This awareness allows the individual to more consistently choose responses rooted in the fresh reality of the present moment, thus weakening and eventually breaking that debilitating feedback loop. That's the path toward genuine self-mastery. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive into the Foundations of Angel Wing, Volume 1, it offers a really profound, almost architectural roadmap for understanding our internal lives. We've established that memory isn't a recorder, it's an architect, and it's inherently biased by selectivity. We've analyzed that physical mechanism where the amygdala's emotional intensity basically tells the hippocampus how strongly to encode something, leading to that disproportionate weight of painful or intense experiences.
Yes, the emotional imprinting process. And we've seen how the system almost inevitably leads to distortion, where these transient emotional states can harden, coalesce into defining labels, that phenomenon of emotional identification,
Right.
leaving the individual potentially living as a historical echo, constantly sustained by that feedback loop that revives past feelings right here in the present.
And the only way out, it seems, is through cultivating conscious awareness, engaging the prefrontal cortex, our rational mind, to simply observe the pattern without judgment and then consciously choose a response rooted in presence, in tranquility, rather than a reflex dictated by yesterday's pain.
That's the core of it. Understanding the mechanism gives us the power to intervene.
So here is a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider. If you accept, even just tentatively, that maybe your baseline anxiety or your recurring shame or that underlying self-doubt you feel is largely the architectural residue of a few intensely encoded past events, what would happen if you stopped trying so hard to analyze or fix those specific memory bricks?
Interesting question.
What if instead you focus only on observing the cyclical process itself? The process of identification, the arising of the echo, the emotional revival, watching it happen in the present moment without getting caught.
The opportunity there is immense. It's the recognition that the self you believe you are, the one defined by those echoes, is perhaps merely a temporary story created by a biased internal editor. The real power lies in realizing you can pause the playback of that historical echo
Yeah.
and consciously choose a new foundation, built entirely in the freedom and the freshness of this present moment.
We really hope this deep dive helps you start noticing that architecture and perhaps even begin writing that new story. Until next time.
Goodbye for now.